The first time my grandfather came alive, he had been dead for 94 years. That was about 2 years ago, when the treasurer of my local British Legion branch had emailed me in the hope that I, a keen student of modern history, might do a talk to the Legion on any matter pertaining to military history. Inadvertently, he had nudged something inside me, and within an hour of the treasurer making this suggestion, I had agreed to do a talk. Some parts of what is to follow had lain dormant in the far outposts of my mind. Other parts were yet to be revealed to me. And some parts which I had thought to be true turned out not to be true. The following is, to a certain extent, a familiar story of sacrificial lambs going to the slaughter. But it also speaks of old fashions and old mores. Stoicism, Christianity, manliness and duty, which now, in the scheme of things, are regarded as unenlightened, if not disdainful. The values that sustained soldiers a century ago are now largely rejected. Those who fought in the First World War lived in many ways in a different world. The Edwardian world was one of extreme discrepancy between rich and poor. For the upper classes, privilege held sway. For the working poor and those facing grinding poverty, industrial drudgery and lack of aspiration was the norm. Yet despite this, there were shared values across the social spectrum. Stoic attitudes were built into both the public school ethos and the daily working grind of the majority. Hardship was to be endured, and emotion was a matter to be contained and not expressed. Acceptance and perseverance were the bedrock of both personal coping and social order. These ways of viewing the world are now largely alien to us. But if these values are not taken into account and instead regarded as the aberrations of an unenlightened past, the experience of the Great War soldier cannot be fully understood. These values enable most to survive, despite occasions of horror and terror, often in conditions that we would now view as insufferable. J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings was inspired by and infused with Great War imagery. Tolkien, whom had been commissioned into the 13th Lancashire Fusiliers, acknowledged that the nightmare landscape of Mordor had its origin in his experience of the Somme battlefield. Sam Gamgee, Frodo Baggins' trusted manservant, in his increasingly purgatorial journey across Mordor to Mount Doom and victory over evil, expresses the nature of the British Tommy as Tolkien perceived it. Tolkien stated that he was a portrait of the English soldier, of the private and human I knew in the 1914 war and recognized as so superior to myself. The image is of a man of courage, endurance, and steadfastness, whose limited vision only strengthened his loyalty. Romantic vision this may be, parody it is not. This courage, endurance, and steadfastness that Tolkien refers to could also be described as acceptance, that what cannot be changed must be accepted. J.H.M. Staniforth, an officer in the Connaught Rangers, composed a coping mantra that exemplifies this acceptance. The only way to be here is to be philosophical. We have evolved the philosophy accordingly. What do you think of it? If you are a soldier, you are either at home or at the front. If at home, you needn't worry. If at the front, you are either out of the danger zone or in it. If you are out of the danger zone, you needn't worry. If you are in the danger zone, you are either not hit or hit. If not hit, you needn't worry. If you are hit, it is either trivial or dangerous. If trivial, you needn't worry. If dangerous, you either live or die. If you live, you needn't worry. And if you die, you can't worry. So why worry? This type of gallows humour reflects an ingrained stoicism. What cannot be changed must be accepted. In L.P. Hartley's immortal words in his novel The Go-Between, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. At 6:15 p.m. on 30th of June 1916, the 11th Battalion Accrington East Lancashire Regiment, also known as the Accrington Pals, left a Warnament Wood in the Somme to begin a march of more than 6 miles to the Allied frontline trenches facing Serre, a small, heavily fortified village on the German front line. Despite the promises of a walkover, it was a rare man who felt no anxiety over what the morning would bring. Each soldier carried a rifle and equipment, less pack, a ground sheet rolled on the belt with a mess tin on top, a haversack on the back, 170 rounds of small arms ammunition, 4 Mills bombs, 4 empty sandbags, a gas helmet rolled under a steel helmet, iron rations in addition to 1 complete day's rations, and a tin triangle tied with string to the outside of the haversack. At certain points on the march, Lieutenant Colonel Rickman, the commanding officer, in order to make up for lost time, had ordered his troops out of the main communication trench which connected to the front lines so as to continue the march on land. This trench had been flooded with over a foot of water and gluey mud, and this had subsequently made the going very tough, slow and arduous, especially given the weight of equipment that the battalion was carrying on its backs. At certain points there would be a logjam of soldiers stuck one behind the other, most notably at trench corners. The above photo depicts a bombed-out sugar beet factory known as Le Sucrerie, which was close to the front line. It was 2:40 a.m., 4 hours later than planned, before Rickman, at the head of the column, reached the front line. Here he then deployed the 4 platoons that were to comprise the first wave of the attack in partially blown-in fire bays. The second wave gathered some 60 yards behind, while the third and fourth waves were held some 300 yards back. The 6-mile march had taken over 9 hours. On the map before you, the battalion's 4 waves are marked in pink. The white section marked S1 to S2 to the right of the 4 waves was no man's land. Exhausted from the march and the carrying of heavy equipment, the 4 waves tried to rest for the next 3 hours, although that was difficult as German artillery fire of every calibre persisted. During the previous afternoon, the battalion had paraded for the last time. It was then that Lieutenant Colonel Rickman had reminded the men of the battalion's origins, the people that they represented, and what was expected of them the next day. Later that day, Lieutenant Colonel Rickman had written to the Mayor of Accrington the following: "We are on the eve of the biggest battle the world has yet known. We are destined for a very hard trial. Work has been very intense and we have been subject to very hard bombardments. I think you will be proud of the way the men stick it. There have been difficulties those in England could not credit unless they experienced them. I have only now received 16 watches for the platoon commanders, which are essential for the present operations. The lads realise the seriousness of what is to come, and I feel they will do their part. It is a page of history that will take some writing." As daylight dawned on 1st July, the Germans were fully aware of the impending attack. The gaps in the battalion's own wire, which had been cut to give advancing troops access to no man's land, and the white tapes that had been laid overnight as guides for the attacking waves, could easily be observed from the German lines. This photo is of a German sentry looking out over no man's land. The intensive artillery bombardment to precede the attack had opened up on June the 24th. The bombardment was intended to shatter the enemy trench system and destroy his barbed wire and machine gun posts to prepare the way for the attack of 17 divisions on the 15-mile-long British sector of the front. The enemy wire had to be cut. If this should remain intact, the planned walk over no man's land into the enemy front line would end literally on the wire. At an inspection of the 11th Battalion 3 weeks earlier by Lieutenant General Sir A.G. Hunter, the 8th Army Corps Commander, or Hunter Bunter as he was known to the troops, Private Snellam of the 11th Battalion, who was in the front rank of the inspection, had later remarked in writing, "He gave us the usual thing about doing our bit cheerily in the big push. We knew he said the same to everybody. And he confidently assured us the planned artillery barrage would completely destroy the German wire and forward trenches. He told us that there would be no Germans left in the trenches when we got there. In Hunter Weston's very own words, there would not even be a rat alive, he said." The 11th Battalion East Lancashire Regiment had, by June the 30th, 1916, come a long way from their humble beginnings. The battalion was by then a fighting force prepared and ready to face combat. It had also come a long way, geographically speaking, from the day the battalion had been formed in Accrington to the day the battalion had arrived at the trenches overlooking the German front lines at the village of Serre. The battalion had arrived at the Western Front by way of Accrington, Carnarvon, Rugeley, Ripon, Salisbury Plain, and Egypt, then back to Marseille, and finally a 4-day journey to the front by train. What was it about the Accrington pals that has made them such a totemic symbol of the mass slaughter on the Somme, of which plays, books, and songs have been written about this battalion? Why has this battalion garnered greater attention than other PALS battalions who also fought so courageously on the Somme? Well, for one thing, Accrington, in raising a battalion, was punching way above its weight, and in doing so would gain a character that was distinct from other battalions. Its success in this endeavour meant that it was sparring with the big boys, the major industrial cities of Britain, such as Glasgow, Manchester, Cardiff, and Leeds. As it was, Accrington was the only non-county borough in the country to raise a full battalion for Kitchener's new model army. It was also the smallest town in Britain to have raised a complete battalion. When the battalion was finally raised, the legend of Little Accrington, having raised over 1,000 men, had been born. The Accrington Pals had now become the epitome of the Kitchener New Army battalions. But what followed on the morning of 1st July 1916 was to have devastating consequences for the town, which would bestow on it another altogether different legendary status, one that would change the methodology of army recruitment. Accrington was, in the hot summer of 1914, a town of about 45,000 people. It was famous for textile machinery, bricks, and its football team. Howard and Buller, makers of textile machinery, had been selling and installing thousands of machines worldwide every year. It was one of the largest of its kind in the world. The company employed over 7,000 people. 7 collieries and 32 cotton mills completed the industrial basis of the town's economy. In the years leading up to the Great War, the country had been ravaged by industrial strife, which had manifested itself in strikes by the unions and lockouts by the companies. In the summer of 1914, Howard and Buller had shut out the workers, refusing to accept their pay demands. Given the knock-on effects of this dispute, which was now into its 8th week, the town had reached an economic impasse. This impasse was exacerbated by several cotton mills on lockdown due to falling demand. On August the 7th, 2 days after war was declared against Germany, Kitchener had made his first appeal for 100,000 volunteers. From that day, his famous recruiting posters appeared on every hoarding and in every shop window. Kitchener had disagreed with the War Office and Cabinet view that it would be a short war. He believed that it would last at least 3 years and would not be won at sea as most had thought, but after many bloody battles on the European continent. Therefore, Great Britain's small regular army would not be sufficient. Given that he held the view that the territorials were untrained amateurs who would be unfit to replace regular troops, and that he also had a low opinion of the Special Reserve, Kitchener proposed to raise a new army of at least 1 million men. Although by 1914 gradual reforms had improved the regular army, the public idea of an army recruited from social misfits and the very poor had died hard. But with Kitchener a demigod in many people's eyes now making his own appeal, his personal stamp of approval would make the new army an opportunity for decent citizens to join a respectable army. General Sir Henry Rawlinson suggested that men would be more inclined to enlist in the army if they knew that they were going to serve alongside their friends and colleagues. He appealed to London stockbrokers to raise a battalion of men from workers in the City of London to set an example. 1,600 men enlisted in this 10th Service Battalion Royal Fusiliers, the so-called Stockbrokers Battalion, within a week in late August 1914. A few days later, the Earl of Derby and Mayor of Liverpool decided to raise a battalion of men from Liverpool. Within 2 days, 1,500 Liverpudlians had joined the battalion. Speaking to these men, Lord Derby said, "This should be a battalion of pals, a battalion in which friends from the same office will fight shoulder to shoulder for the honour of Britain and the credit of Liverpool." Within the next 3 days, 3 more battalions were raised in Liverpool, forming the 17th, 18th, 19th and 20th battalions of the King's Regiment Liverpool. But the men who had enlisted always regarded themselves as the 1st, 2nd, 3rd and 4th Liverpool Pals. Lord Derby's success excited the imaginations of mayors and corporations of many towns around Great Britain. The idea of citizens of the same town recruited, equipped and serving together greatly appealed to their patriotism and civic pride. Local efforts in recruiting, equipping and housing their own units were without precedent for a population unused to the idea of general military service. Shortly after the first PALS battalions had been raised in Liverpool and then Manchester, a letter to the editor of the Observer and Times, Accrington's local paper, had urged Accrington to follow suit. We hear of great numbers of men coming forwards in different parts of the country, and Manchester is earning itself distinction for the readiness of its men to offer themselves. Why not Accrington? 2 days after this letter was published, John Harwood, the mayor of Accrington, who held the rank of captain, contacted the War Office offering to raise half a battalion. A few days later, the War Office replied to Harwood, notifying him that it would be a matter of raising a full battalion or none at all. Harwood, caught up in the euphoria that was sweeping the country, then raised his offer to a full battalion. His offer was accepted, with the proviso that the town would take responsibility for the battalion's training, housing and clothing. Harwood now faced a daunting task. For a start, several hundred men from Accrington had already volunteered to enlist in other units. If Harwood was to raise a battalion, he would have to act quickly. 2 days after Harwood had raised his offer, a captain, James Climo Milton, having had his proposal to raise a company of 250 men from Chorley turned down by other units, approached Harwood, who gratefully accepted his offer. This was before Harwood had commenced recruiting in Accrington. To raise a full battalion, Harwood had by then realised that he would have to increase his area of recruitment. With the help of others, notably Colonel Richard Sharples, a commanding officer of the National Reserve Battalion of the 5th East Lancashire Regiment, and now an Accrington solicitor, around half of the battalion was recruited from Accrington and district, while the majority of the remainder was raised in the neighbouring towns of Burnley, Blackburn and Chorley. The battalion was effectively raised in 10 days. Timing was a factor in this outcome. Pressure from posters and newspaper comments, as well as lurid stories of alleged German atrocities in Belgium, played their part. But also financial hardship was a motivating factor in enlistment. With the shutout at Howard and Buller now in its 10th week, and with 7,000 cotton workers unemployed, the resultant poverty had made many men and boys join up. The pay was an attractive part of it, but there was also an initial patriotism and the notion that the war would be over by Christmas. In these circumstances, to be a soldier in the company of one's friends and to be paid, at least for the time being, for staying at home with one's family was a combination difficult to resist. By November the 4th, Harwood and Colonel Sharples published their list of officers appointed by Harwood. Local families prominent in the area's business and social life overwhelmingly predominated. Harwood saw these appointments as an extension of the authority and leadership which these families' public standing in the town had given them. The social structure of the Accrington Battalion now, in effect, mirrored the social structure of the town. These youthful, newly appointed officers integrated into the battalion, in part because they were already well known to most of the men as sons and employers or men in public life, and given that they were not short of enthusiasm and were game to take on any task, they gained the respect and friendship of the NCOs and men. The recommended 6-month training syllabus consisted of physical training, squad drill, some musketry practice, lectures and regular route marches. The hours entailed in these activities gradually increasing from 42 hours per fortnight to 55 hours. By early 1915, the character of the battalion was in its early stages of being formed, with existing friendships strengthened and new, in some cases, lifelong ones being made. That's Colonel Sharple's retard in the front middle leading this route march. Strict discipline, though, was lacking, unlike that of the regular army, so a spit and polish attitude was difficult to imbue in men wearing civilian clothes who went home to their families in the evening. But all this would soon be addressed. On 16 February 1915, the battalion, now newly attired in what was described as a Melton blue uniform, was inspected by Major General Dixon. Having passed muster, the Mayor of Accrington, knowing that the men in the battalion were eager to leave town and go into training elsewhere, made the long-awaited announcement. They were to leave for Carnarvon in a week's time. At the suggestion of Colonel Sharples, it was agreed that the battalion should march through the centre of the town before the battalion left for Carnarvon, to give the townspeople an opportunity to see what some of their menfolk had now become. The battalion, now consisting of 1,350 men and 36 officers, and on the orders of Western Command HQ, were to be billeted in Carnarvon in hotels, boarding houses and private homes. This type of accommodation was to be very different from their future accommodation. 5 days after arriving at Carnarvon, the battalion were to meet their new commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Rickman, a professional soldier. He would be the only professional soldier in the entire battalion. They waited for him on parade in Castle Square. Lieutenant Rawcliffe later wrote, "I'll never forget that day. We were brought up to attention as Colonel Rickman rode up the street towards us. He had to pass a motor lorry parked outside a shop. This narrowed the street and his horse shied. We all thought that the horse was going to go through the shop window. But Colonel Rickman beat the horse hard with his stick. It wasn't a riding crop, but an ash walking stick, to make it pass the lorry. We saw a real display of strength and willpower. What an entrance, I thought. We're in for it now." Private Pollard also wrote, "Our new CO came on parade riding a hunter. It was wild and skittish, rearing up on its hind legs, but he kept it under control. He was very smart, a true professional. We were looking at a real soldier for the first time. We knew he would sort us out." The cynical view was that the hunter reared on its hind legs only when Lieutenant Colonel Rickman wished it. But if Rickman's intentions were to impress with his horsemanship, he succeeded. It left a lasting effect. Rickman's horse Ben remained with Rickman on active service throughout the war. Apparently, only Rickman could handle the horse. Other lessons were also learnt that day. Private Marshall was to write, "The Colonel noticed a young soldier who happened to have his belt on upside down, and so he had him brought to the very front of the parade. This sort of thing was unheard of before. After that, his mates made sure the lad was properly dressed before going on parade." We will hear more from Private Marshall later. Lieutenant Colonel Rickman had been born in 1874, the son of a lieutenant general. He had followed his father into the army by obtaining a commission in the Northumberland Fusiliers. He had served in the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902, gaining the Queen's Medal with 4 clasps and the King's Medal with 2 clasps. On 10th December 1899, ranked as a lieutenant, he fought at the catastrophic Battle of Stormberg, where his battalion lost hundreds of men, many taken as prisoners. He thus knew how a battle could go badly wrong. In a letter home written in December 1901 from the Veld, he wrote the following: "I think life out here has been an experience for most of us. Certainly one has learned more of one's profession by this campaign than 20 years of peace soldiering would ever have taught one. And one does things out here that teach one responsibility. When you think you have men's lives in your hands, you think a great deal. Men too know if you are in the wrong, but they follow all the same." He also had the opportunity to see how war was run at a senior level within 22 Brigade, and then at the elbow of Major General R.A.P. Clements, gaining a good grasp of organisation both at battalion level and a more senior level. Aside from periods of absence due to wounds or on the orders of high command, Rickman was to lead the battalion throughout the remainder of the war. Under Rickman, the training became more rigorous, but that training was always handicapped by a lack of specialist equipment. Of the new, much tougher training, Private Will Cowell wrote to his wife, "The weather is grand here, but they're starting to put us through it. We do as much before breakfast as we did all day in Accrington." Private Earl Whitaker wrote to his sister, "We will not do so much dodging here as we have got a new colonel, and he is very strict." As some compensation for his strictness, Rickman stopped Saturday parades and encouraged all sports, particularly cricket, football, and cross-country running. But he also let it be known that he disapproved of heavy drinking. It was at Carnarvon that the men were issued the much coveted khaki uniform complete with leather equipment. This new uniform was a bonus to the men, as some had compared the Melton blue one to a convict's uniform. Also, each man was issued with a worn-out Lee Metford rifle. 2 months later, upon inspection by the Inspector of Infantry, the battalion passed muster and were to be transferred to Rugeley in Staffordshire to join up with 94 Infantry Brigade. Many of the Carnarvon townsfolk were on the streets to watch the battalion parade through the town on its way to the railway station, even though it was very early in the morning. Crowds blocked the station approach. As the flags and handkerchiefs were waved, there were girls glimpsing boyfriends for the very last time, some undoubtedly by choice, some due to the misfortunes of war, while others after the war were to marry upon their boyfriend's return. As the trains drew out, the battalion left the town cheering and singing music hall songs. The 11th Battalion had endeared themselves to the townsfolk of Carnarvon. Rugeley, like other vast camps, was built to provide training spaces for brigade and division size. As you can imagine, it was very different to what the battalion had been used to in Carnarvon. It was here that men volunteered or were appointed to specialised positions. Cooking, transporting, medical, regimental policing, and sanitary sections all came into being. After a short course, the cooks had to provide for hundreds of men. Here are some of them. Bayonet practice became a regular feature of the battalion's time at Rugeley. With the bayonet at the ready, the men would roar down the assault course, bridging barbed wire and planks, and after clearing hurdles, they would charge and bayonet Jerry, which was a bag of sawdust. The training manual that was used nationwide by the inexperienced officers and South African war veteran NCOs stated that battle tactics were the following. The essential to success in battle is to close with the enemy, cost what it may. The action of the infantry must be a constant pressing forward, and as the enemy fire is gradually subdued, further progress will be made by bounds from place to place until the enemy can be assaulted by bayonet. The battalion endlessly practiced this role, never actually to put it into action in the real world of the front. They were, of course, not to be alone in this. It was at Rugeley, also, that Rickman contacted Harwood, the mayor of Accrington, to arrange for a set of instruments to be sent to the battalion in order to form a marching band. Prior to the formation of this band, there had only been a makeshift comic band. Rickman was of the thinking that a good band would be not only prestigious, but also a morale booster. Here's the comic band. It was at Rugeley that Rickman had decided to move the battalion to South Camp, Ripon, in Yorkshire for a musketry course. From there, he intended to march the battalion from Ripon to East Lancashire, accompanied by the band, over a period of 8 days. This wasn't for the sake of marching, but rather the need for more volunteers. The shell scandal of the Asquith government on the Western Front had forced Asquith to form a coalition government, with Lloyd George now becoming the Minister of Munitions. Lloyd George was determined to reorganise the munitions industry so as to meet the demands of war. To do this, he needed to address the shortage of skilled labour in this industry. As a consequence of this, the 11th Battalion was ordered to send back those soldiers who were skilled engineers to Howard and Buller, which had now been transformed into a munitions factory. Hence, Rickman's plans to march the battalion back to its hometown in an attempt to recruit more volunteers. However, authority for him to move the battalion to Ripon did not arrive for a month, so his idea had to be dropped. Instead, the campaign to raise more recruits had to be conducted on the way to Ripon via Accrington and its environs. As a public relations exercise, the battalion's return home was a success. The whole town turned out. An estimated 18,000 lined the streets as John Harwood took the salute at the march past in front of the town hall. 6 months' training and discipline had made a tremendous improvement in their bearing, physique and self-esteem. They were proud in their belief that they were one of the best of the Kitchener battalions and considered themselves the equal of any in the British Army. But as a recruiting drive, it was a failure. By this time, morale was being hit by letters from the Western Front from survivors of the heavy fighting. Also, the demand for munition workers with their concomitant high wages affected recruitment. It didn't help either that workers in the cotton mills were reluctant to enlist because employers would not guarantee them their jobs after the war. Patriotism and a sense of adventure as a recruiting device were all very well at the start of the war, but these two motivations were now beginning to wear thin. By October 1915, recruiting had now become a national and political matter. By January 1916, conscription for single men was introduced. Then, this was to be followed in May that same year by universal conscription. In the background, you can make out the battalion marching through the town. The Accrington Observer and Times was later to remark that Rickman won the favour and confidence of the battalion, whilst all who came into contact with him during the brief time he spent in Accrington had held him in high regard as an officer and a gentleman. On August 11th, 1915, the Deputy Chief of the Imperial General Staff, having inspected the battalion, informed Rickman of the following. I have inspected tens of thousands of troops in Kitchener's army, but I have never seen a smarter, better turned out battalion. A great deal of trouble has been taken, and I am delighted. At 41, Rickman was a comparatively young commanding officer. He had achieved much in his 6 months with the battalion without the help of a single officer or NCO whom had had a recent battle experience. But Rickman was not to know that what was referred to as the active service standards that the battalion had now attained would be totally unrealistic for trench warfare. Although undoubtedly strict with his men, Rickman's responsibilities did not distance him from them. It was said that he had a reputation for kind-hearted autocracy. For example, immediately after the Deputy Chief of the Imperial General Staff's inspection, Private Fisher, aged 18, was later to write, "We had just come off parade and a telegram awaited me at the office. My mother had died. I was only a lad and in tears. The CO came in very stern and formidable, and to my utter surprise said very softly, 'My boy, try to compose yourself.' He then turned to the sergeant and roared, 'Take that man's name and send him home immediately.'" By late September 1915, the battalion had now moved to a camp on Salisbury Plain. Here, brand new short magazine Lee Enfield rifles and Lewis light machine guns were issued, along with signalling equipment. Bombers and medical staff also appeared. It was a period of intensive training, and given that all the equipment had now arrived, the military organisation and structure of the battalion was finally complete. After a hard day's military exercise, Lance Corporal Bradshaw wrote, "God only knows how we would have gone on but for Colonel Rickman. At 7 p.m. he had not taken his full pack off. He was everywhere." With time in England now limited, some were allowed 48-hour leave. Lieutenant Rawcliffe, on returning from leave, discovered that there had been a to-do. He wrote, "Jack Ruttle and George Williams, both lieutenants, had decided to shave off their moustaches. On morning parade, Colonel Rickman saw them. 'You've shaved off your moustaches,' he roared. 'Yes, sir.' 'Get off my parade and don't come back until they're grown again.' The lads were in a real dilemma. How on earth could they stay off parade for days on end? But old Rickman soon relented. Of course, his bark was always worse than his bite. The battalion's next destination was Egypt. With the Allied defeat at Gallipoli and the British withdrawal, there was a fear among the High Command that the Turkish army would now concentrate its troops in the Middle East and quite possibly attack and try to take the Suez Canal. The canal was vital to Great Britain's strategic interest, and the defence of it was crucial. And so, in December 1915, as part of 94 Brigade, 31 Division, the 11th Battalion now found itself embarking at Plymouth upon the Ionic. The men were heading for Egypt. As the band on the quayside played Auld Lang Syne, Rickman wrote the following in a letter to the Mayor of Accrington. "You have given me a big charge in the men's lives. I only hope I shall be able to help them in the life that's before them." During the journey to Port Said and just off the coast of Crete, an enemy submarine suddenly appeared 500 yards away. Alarms and klaxons sounded. The Ionic was quickly forced to turn, narrowly avoiding a torpedo which passed 100 feet astern. When the battalion disembarked at Port Said, the men watched as survivors of the SS Persia arrived ashore. The Persia had been hit by a torpedo the day before the Ionic's close shave. The SS Persia had gone down in 5 minutes with the loss of 334 lives. It was probably hit by the same submarine that the Ionic had spotted. The 2.5-month period on the Suez was spent on several missions and tasks. These included forward advances into the Sinai Desert so as to provide warning of any enemy approaches, escorting ships en route for Suez, operating a ferry carrying supplies across the canal, strengthening defences on the eastern side of the canal, and constructing light railway lines to the canal defence system in the open desert. A few of the battalion were to die of heat exhaustion. Here's a picture of some of the men in the Sinai Desert with Lewis machine guns. By mid-February 1916, it had now become clear that the Turks were unlikely to risk an attack on the Suez Canal across the Sinai Desert. So the British High Command had decided that only 3 divisions would be required to defend the canal, leaving 9 other divisions which could now be spared for the more important campaign in France and Belgium known as the Big Push. 31 Division, which the 11th Battalion was part of, was to be one of those divisions which would be transferred to the Western Front. Here's where the battalion ended up, just opposite Serres on the 15-mile stretch where the Battle of the Somme took place.